why we do refeeds, how they work, the mechanisms behind them, and how we can kind of approach them. But bodybuilding will not make sense a lot of times on paper. Believe me when I tell you that. I've prepped thousands of people. Refeeds, super saturation days. My goal is always to reach a ceiling limit. So again, guys, very important. We need that thyroid to be firing and functioning, T4 to T3 conversion. We need to keep reverse T3 down because liver is the biggest fat burning organ. All right, guys, welcome to the Kingdom Built podcast, another special episode. And today we're going to be talking about another topic that was highly requested, which was refeeds. And a lot of people that follow me know that I call refeeds, a specific form of refeed, super saturation day. So we're going to get into some essentials and basics, not a huge deep dive into it because this video could literally go on for hours. If it's requested to dive deeper, we definitely can. So, guys, we know that metabolic adaptation can happen in a caloric restriction setting. So specifically when an individual is in a fat loss stage and they're in a caloric deficit, because that's how you have fat loss occur, is having the weekly caloric intake average in a deficit, right? So essentially what will happen during that time is something called metabolic adaptation. It's your metabolism adapting to the energy intake throughout the days and the weeks, aka the calorie intake. As you continue to diet, your body is a wonderful thing created by God, and it knows what to do to survive in those settings. So we are designed to, as the energy intake slows down and gets lowered in a caloric deficit, so will the thyroid hormones and the regulation and thyroid conversion of T4, specifically to T3, will downgrade, and a reverse T3 will actually go higher. Now, when that happens and you have higher levels of reverse T3, so an excess amount of reverse T3 can make it challenging for an active form to bind to the receptors to carry out the functionality of which it needs to. The active being your free T3, the T4 to T3 conversion. That is a necessity for proper thyroid functionality and to be able to have all the benefits of your thyroid functioning at the highest level, to put it in a simplistic form. So I've taken down a few notes of what refeeds do, why we need refeeds, the mechanisms behind the body of the refeeds, how do we approach refeeds, et cetera, et cetera. So during this podcast, I'm going to use an example of a competitor getting ready for a bodybuilding show, classic physique, men's physique, whatever the case may be. And in this said competitor, we're going to start this guy out at 16 to 20 weeks out, typical contest prep setting. And if you're not a competitor, you can put yourself before a photo shoot or a wedding or a beach vacation, so on and so forth. So we're really not going to get into the modalities of cardio, the efficacies of the types of cardios that you can do, your training volume, training split, so on and so forth. We're simply going to be talking about why we do refeeds, how they work, the mechanisms behind them, and how we can kind of approach them. So typically in a contest prep setting, said competitor would be a little higher in body fat, meaning that he's not as insulin sensitive as he will be as he grows closer to the show. So the partitioning of the nutrients, specifically in the form of carbohydrates, are a little lowered in how they are adapting and how they're being moved throughout the body in an optimal rate. Of course, we know as we get leaner, body fat that drops off, partitioning will always improve, insulin sensitivity will always go higher. And a lot of times, more times than not, a lot of people can experience some hypoglycemia during those last couple weeks because they are just running through the type of foods that they're eating, specifically if they are lower fiber containing foods and there is no dietary fats added to it. But I digress. Let's get back to the said competitor dieting down. So in that setting, typically a refeed is not needed because body fat is a little bit higher, because caloric intake on a baseline is higher, because energy levels are definitely higher. They have the ability to start dieting in more of an aggressive form and fashion. So I always tell my guys, listen, in the beginning, especially if we are at a higher body fat level, which typically I don't really push my guys to get very high in body fat. I'm just not a huge fan of gaining a lot of body fat in the progression season. Now, when you're a young man, that's a different setting. There's a time and a place to definitely accrue some body fat in a caloric surplus. That's going to be very important in the early stages of your development to grow properly. But as you get older and more developed and you reach a higher level, we can definitely maintain a leaner physique. This is going to help with lipid profile, cardiovascular health, of course, they correlate together. Insulin sensitivity, they correlate together as well. And overall gut health, brain functionality, and the quality of sleep, just to name a few. And then we can get into, obviously, your training output is a lot more efficient. Your ability to go harder and longer in sets is going to be that much better. So in the beginning of a contest prep setting, as I said, you don't necessarily need to implement high days or refeeds. Now, everybody is a case-by-case scenario. This is not a one-size-shoe-fits-all, but typically we're kind of going based off the average scenario. So you don't necessarily need to have refeeds or high days. Now, as the diet progresses and as metabolic adaptation will happen, T4 to T3 conversion will downregulate. So leptin is a hormone that is secreted by your fat cells that will send a signal to your brain telling you that you are well fed. Now, in a metabolic adaptation, also known as a caloric restrictive diet, where the metabolism adapts to what you're doing, there will be a slowing of the leptin being released, which means you will need to eat more to get that signal to the brain. This is very important for adherency consistently over a long term and a long period of time, which is why a lot of you will experience as you diet into the show, even on these refeed days or cheat meals or higher days, the hunger is almost insatiable. It's very hard to actually feel full, but now you know why, because the leptin has decreased and the signal that it's giving off to the brain that you're well fed is also decreased. So very important to understand that dietary carbohydrates will play a role in replenishing that much more than dietary fats, which is the reason why we will now get into what do we do and structure into the refeed or supersaturation, as I call it, depending on which way we're going or I'm going with the client. So as the athlete diets down and continues to get leaner and insulin sensitivity goes up and fat cells are obviously shrinking, metabolic adaptation is happening due to caloric restriction. And we could also look for other signs. There is going to definitely be a decrease in gym performance. Now, 1 day, 2 days is not a huge key factor in saying I need a refeed. But once you get to about 3 to 4 days or so, and gym performance is coming down and sleep also decreasing, the quality of your sleep and your mood. So obviously there's a huge correlation in your neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, dopamine, being one of the biggest ones, is going to throw off a lot of things going on neurologically, so you'll see your mood decrease as well. These are all signs, along with if progression has halted and or you have reached a point where muscle glycogen is so depleted that we're actually going reverse of where we want to go. So usually I see 4 days being the hardest you can push someone until that starts to occur. Once they are at a specific level of body fat, then you're able to implement those refeeds again, or as I call supersaturation days. Now, we understand that 1 day in this setting of a refeed is not necessarily going to give you that huge burst of T4 to T3 conversion. It's just simply not enough time. You're going to get more of a muscle glycogen fill, a better performance the next day to 48 hours. You're obviously going to get a better look the next day. And from a psychological standpoint, you're going to have more dopamine being released. So you're going to be in a better mood. You're going to feel better. And typically cortisol will drop down. Serotonin will go up. You will sleep better that night as well. So anytime you're sleeping better, you're recovering better, cortisol is dropped. We are definitely helping the process of lipolysis over this period of time that we are utilizing these refeeds, and we are utilizing them for that functionality. So on paper, from a scientific standpoint, you're not necessarily getting that net positive of T4 to T3 conversion in a 24-hour period. But that's okay because on paper, bodybuilding doesn't make sense all the time. So you have to utilize things that make sense in an anecdote setting. So what is working for the said client is what you roll with. You can't always go off scientific literature. It's definitely good to know these things and understand the mechanisms behind them, but bodybuilding will not make sense a lot of times on paper. Believe me when I tell you that. I've prepped thousands of people since 2006, and I've seen some of the most absurd cases where it absolutely would not make sense if you showed, any type of scientist or someone with a doctorate in nutrition or biochemistry or kinesiology or exercise science that has studied the human physiology doesn't always necessarily understand how these mechanisms work in a bodybuilder. And of course, we know there's not long-term studies with a huge clinical controlled study of a bodybuilder or bodybuilders or competitors essentially at a very low level of body fat that are 200 plus pounds in a contest prep body fat levels. It just hasn't occurred. So this is where a little bit of bro science will definitely come in, and experience will definitely trump just understanding only mechanisms behind how these things work and the cascading effect, right? Again, it's great to know these things. So I'm trying to wrap this up, but my mind kind of starts to wander, and I always want to make sure that I help the audience that's listening kind of understand, especially if it's coaches out there, understand why we do what we do. So real quick caveat, because we're talking about thyroid regulation. Now, reverse T3 is a very underchecked and overlooked thyroid function on blood panels. If your reverse T3 is high, you, again, like I explained in the beginning, it's binding up basically the active version of the thyroid of T3 to do what it needs to do in an optimal way. So you will see a lot of downregulation happening in your metabolism, and you will see progress halter. So make sure you're always getting those labs pulled, including that reverse T3, to see where those levels are at. Now, if it is high, there could be, any form of issues going on. We could be talking about gut issues, because T4 to T3 conversion, 20% of that will start in your gut. You could be talking about a mineral or micronutrient deficiency, potassium, B12, iodine, selenium, zinc. All these are going to help with thyroid functionality. I mean, there's so many different things that can correlate into that, and including also liver. So anytime you have elevated liver enzymes, which a lot of competitors do and can, you're going to blunt the production of T4 to T3 conversion as well. So again, guys, these are all levels that you need to check throughout the through the year. To be quite honest with you, I could say contest prep setting, or caloric deficit dieting for an event, a wedding, a photo shoot. But they should be checked regularly. I check these levels every 8 to 10 weeks. It's very, very important because I want to be sharp as a tack. I want to have cognition. I want to have memory, word recall. I mean, there's a lot for me to do on a lot on my plate. So I have to make sure that my thyroid is functioning properly so that I have the energy to actually achieve these goals and the sharpness in my brain. So I want to make sure all these levels are directly correlating together. They're cascading in, there's conversion happening, and everything is functioning at the most optimal level. And so do you if you are in this phase of a caloric deficit and we have reached metabolic adaptation. We want to make sure that we do everything we can before you guys start to self-prescribe pharmacology in the form of T3 therapy or T4 therapy, armor thyroid therapy, if you want to call it these things. Always start with your micronutrients first, your selenium, your iodine, and your zinc. You need to cover those bases. Copper is also another one that's very overlooked as well. So again, big caveat. Let's get back to the refeeds. How do we structure them? Why we're doing them. So now you know some of the setting of why we do them and what it changes in metabolic adaptation so that we can continue progress, right? Because we want fat loss to happen. There's a difference between fat burning and fat loss. We want that lipolysis, that fat loss, to start happening and continue to happen and hang on to as much muscle tissue as we can. That's the whole goal of what we're trying to achieve. So with refeeds and supersaturation days, as I said, 4 days is usually the max you can push somebody until they hit that limit. And then we need to implement in the form of a carbohydrate, heavy carb laden menu for the day to really get all these things firing correctly. So the way that I like to set it up, whether it's a lifestyle guy or a competitor, is of course we want to utilize the foods that they're used to. We want to utilize foods that they know that we want to utilize foods that we know don't cause a systemic inflammatory response. We want to use foods that are really going to cause gastric emptying to happen very fast as well, because it is a high volume of food to get in a lot of carbohydrates. You know, I've had guys at up to 1,500, 2,000 grams of carbohydrates on supersaturation days. So we're doing a combination of foods. I will just give an example. You know, we are utilizing things like my buddy Sean Vasquez at Rice and Grinds, cream of rice in there. We're utilizing, green bananas, because green bananas will have resistant starch to feed the good gut bacteria and create more butyrate in the system. So remember, we're always trying to get some positives out of these refeeds too. So we're going to use that. We're going to definitely throw in some fiber in the form of low sugar berries as well, or low sugar oatmeal, maybe even some whole grains in there. But typically I'll err on the side of more fermented sourdough bread. I love sourdough and high volume. It's very easy to get down and it's a very dense carbohydrate. Typically 55, 56 grams on the scale of sourdough. Before you toast, it's about 30, 35 grams of carbs. Phenomenal carbohydrate to utilize in a refeed setting. I'll also use some cereal as well. Now, over the years, I've changed my perspective because, again, and this is different for everybody. Some people I still have used kids cereal, but I'll err, for me especially, on the side of like an Arrowhead buckwheat, maple buckwheat cereal. Digests very easy, no systemic inflammation, very dense in carbohydrates. Cinnamon raisin Ezekiel cereal, because about a half a cup dry is 40 grams of carbs, so an extremely dense carbohydrate. So let's see what else we got. We mentioned the sourdough. We mentioned the kids' cereal. We mentioned, of course, we have jasmine rice in there. That's kind of a typical thing. But there's only so much rice you can take in, right? So then we may even go into white rice pasta, another great form in addition to add in. We have low-fat sorbet, phenomenal to add in low-fat sorbet. Of course, quality sushi, low-fat sushi, no cream cheese, no fried, very low in avocado, adding into the rolls, and or low amounts of salmon. So we're going for the shrimp, we're going for the tuna, we're going for the super white tuna, the albacore tuna, and we're eating a lot of sushi in the form of either nigiri or sushi rolls. Very easy to get down, and everybody listening to this doesn't like sushi, but that's a great, phenomenal choice to add in. And then, of course, we have some carbohydrates in the form of liquids, right? So Vitargo, S2, highly branched cyclic dextrins are good. Even organic pomegranate juice, organic apple juice. Now, these are very, very high quality, organic, single ingredient juices, and they're timed around the training. Or you can even get an organic applesauce. Applesauce is great because it has pectin in it. So very, very good for the GI. You have very dense dried fruits in the form of dates. Majol dates are great additions into refeeds. And flavored rice cakes, just to kind of give you guys a little overview. And also raw local honey. So if you can get an organic raw local honey, phenomenal for your immune system. Phenomenal for histamine levels, and phenomenal way to get a lot of carbohydrates in a very small volume of food. Now, what makes my supersaturation days different than a refeed is we will get to a peak concentration level of carbohydrates where we eventually have to add in some quote unquote dirtier foods, which can come in the form of homemade grass-fed bison burgers with sourdough bread. If we're using cheese, we're definitely going to go for grass-fed cheese. Again, I don't want a systemic inflammatory response after this refeed. I want this to be a positive and produce the results into the next day that we're looking for. Sweet potato fries, homemade. Then we could go into homemade desserts, muffins, sourdough cookies, carrot cake. Again, I said low-fat sorbet. We could even make homemade sub sandwiches, with meat in it, double chicken. There's recipes for homemade pasta, ground bison into white rice noodles, and organic low-sodium tomato sauce with Texas toast from sourdough bread. And then we may need to add in some foods that are even dirtier than that, higher fat contents as well. This is an individual that's obviously processing and running through food so fast. And this is also equating in the fact that cardio has been cut to next to nothing. Fat burners are cut next to nothing. So then we need to make sure that we're bringing in these modalities, we're bringing in these foods, we're bringing in and employing all these things that we need to hold on to lean tissue and make sure we're controlling everything that we need to control, because that's what it's all about, is variable control. And all these little avenues and areas of refeeds or supersaturations. All right, so how do we structure that? We went over the forms of carbohydrates, which is mostly responsible for helping leptin, T4 to T3 conversion, lowering reverse T3, of course, refilling glycogen, and doing everything we need to do for performance to increase over the next 48 to 72 hours before the drop-off happens again. Now, what I like to do, because carbs are protein sparing, is I definitely, and I've been doing this since 2006, I will cut protein essentially in half on those days. It's just not necessary. It's just going to slow down gastric emptying. The goal at the end of the day is to be able to take in the amount of carbs needed to get all these benefits. Gastric emptying is at an optimal rate, so you're actually feeling good throughout the day. You're not stuffed to the max and bloated and full. We're eating the foods that work best for the body. So protein is lowered down because, again, carbohydrates are protein sparing, so it's not needed for that day. And then we have the high amount of carbohydrates, with fats being at trace next to nothing, minimal. The focus, gentlemen, and the focus audience, my friends, is going to be carbohydrates on these days until we need to employ all the other things. Again, if we're getting too fast, if we're dropping off too fast, and the body's not able to hold on to what we're putting into it from a macronutrient perspective. So that's when variations and variables will come in and change. I'm specifically talking about the majority average person that is utilizing these refeeds to continue to move in a positive forward motion. So that's how I would structure it. And I would also structure it up to 6 to 8 to 9 meals throughout the day. So meal frequency is even higher. Meal volume's lower in the form of dietary fats being next to nothing, protein in half, but carbohydrates obviously being increased. How much, we can touch on that. But meal frequency is a lot higher. And I like this because I like to take in smaller amounts throughout the day, again, for better absorption and gastric emptying and a positive effect. It just makes the refeed that much easier. And what I've noticed anecdotally is if someone is very, very hungry, that dopamine is flowing through the entire day, and it just sets them up for a phenomenal day. Their gym performance is great. Their mood is elevated, which helps their family, friends, and loved ones. They're just driven and determined to do whatever it takes because of this massive release of dopamine. Cortisol, again, like I said, is dropped, and sleep is that much more improved throughout the night, especially if they've been struggling the last couple weeks. So that is a small synopsis of how I would set up the day. Now, how many carbohydrates do you need is going to be based off you as the individual and based off, if you have a coach, what your coach has you doing. Typically, what I would do as an example is if I have said individual on a baseline day of 225 grams of carbs and on an off low menu of 100 to 75 grams of carbs, my goal is to get that person into a ceiling capacity on these refeed days. So I will take them up anywhere from, if they were at 225 to 500 or 750 or 1,000, depending on where we're at and how I know the body's response. And what I mean by the body's response is not only how it responds to the amount of food, how the gym performance is, but you check their weight over the next 72 hours to 4 to 5 days, and you see how fast does said individual get back to their baseline weight before the refeed. Now, once you grasp this and you start to fully understand with all variables controlled how fast an individual can return back to baseline, it makes these refeeds to set these up in such a phenomenal way that it's literally like clockwork, for lack of better terms. And it becomes almost easy and simplistic to be able to set them up, know what's going to happen. Essentially, we don't always go by the scale, but it is a good gauge to always see what's going on based off that equated with the best look. Those two coincide together, typically, especially on show day. But I digress again, getting all over the place. I always like to dive a little bit deeper and over explain things again so that the audience at home can understand what I'm talking about. So, refeeds, supersaturation days, my goal is always to reach a ceiling limit that we possibly can reach and even break through that ceiling, so to speak, where I don't care if the individual the next day gains 3 to 4 to 5 pounds. I'm not concerned about that. And a lot of people may disagree because they would say law of thermodynamics, calories in, calories out over the course of the week. And I said in the beginning, a big role in lipolysis and fat loss over that week is being in an average caloric deficit. But again, we're talking about someone that's not average, but someone that's phenomenal, that's getting in shape, getting in these body fat levels that are not the norm, that are off the textbooks in the form of how many carbohydrates you can set up and how it works and how it runs essentially. You can't always go by the textbook. So you have to find what works best for you. And what I try to do is titrate it up as the diet goes on. So these individuals are eating their highest carb days or refeeds or supersaturations by the end of the prep is always the goal. It's always the goal. So I want to be able to get into an almost overfed state on these days so that we can train as hard as possible over the course of the next 2 to 4 days. We can get back into pushing the calories low, getting the performance in the gym, getting that dopamine release so that they have that drive, even though we are process driven over motivation. It's important to understand that not all individuals click with that mindset. So we need to understand the mechanisms of the neuromodulator from dopamine and how that works. So I'm setting someone up from a physiological standpoint into a psychological standpoint for the best result over the course of the next 4 to 6 days or when we do this again. It is not outside of the norm that I may have someone run these high days twice a week. Heck, I've had people do 3. It all depends on the individual. And this is why it's important to get labs pulled throughout the contest prep or the diet to see what's going on from that hormonal standpoint, right? So again, guys, very important. We need that thyroid to be firing and functioning, T4 to T3 conversion. We need to keep reverse T3 down into an optimal range. And we can do these things by making sure that we have our liver detoxified as much as possible, because liver is the biggest fat burning organ. Very important. We also need to make sure that we're managing stress as much as possible, because managing stress and the release of cortisol is definitely not only putting you in what's called the sympathetic nervous system fight or flight, it will downregulate that T4 to T3 conversion. And it's very easy to be in this state of mind throughout a contest prep or a diet, a caloric deficit, because you are constantly hungry, you're food focused for the most part, your energy output is higher than normal with cardio, with posing, with steps, with training. So of course, cortisol naturally is going to be higher. So then we need to bring in specific modalities to fix that. And we could use anything in the form of rhodiola rosea, ashwagandha. Phosphatidylserine is a phenomenal supplement to also use to regulate cortisol. I've talked about amodin, not Imodium, but amodin, to be able to basically block cortisol, which will help you sleep as well at night. Very good product as well. Not many people speak on it, but a phenomenal tool to use in a caloric deficit for a contest prep setting or an event prep. At night to specifically help sleep as well. Phenomenal stuff. So there's a few supplements right there. Some people react well to ashwagandha, some people don't. So I usually don't recommend it too much. And of course, magnesium. Magnesium bisglycinate. So magnesium is phenomenal. 3 and 8 is very good for brain cognitive function. Magnesium levels being optimal are going to be very important for the body internally just to function at a most optimal rate. In regards to cortisol and trying to regulate staying into parasympathetic, rest and digest, rather than fight or flight, sympathetic, that's also going to reduce that T4 to T3 conversion, increase reverse T3. So we are really harnessing on to that metabolic adaptation even more. So these are variables that we need to make sure that we are controlling to the best of our ability. So we've structured the refeed. We've set up the types of food that we're eating. And there's much more foods, guys. Listen, there's definitely more foods you can utilize, but we'd be spending hours on this video. We've talked about liver detoxification for optimal thyroid, stress management for optimal thyroid. We've talked about why leptin will decrease during the diet and why you are hungry all the time and how the refeeds will help increase leptin levels so that you don't have that feeling of not being well fed. So adherency is easier to continue on for the amount of time. Because guys, remember, at the end of the day, getting in shape like this is very hard. So from a psychological standpoint, you can't look at these refeeds just because you don't feel good that you need a refeed. It's not necessarily the case. And more times than not, most people don't. But we're talking about the people in the settings that do, how we can utilize them, how we can manage them to our best optimal ability and control these variables so that we can continue with fat loss over the said period of time and retain as much muscle tissue and continue having proper healthy thyroid functionality so that we can move forward in doing all these things, guys. So again, not a full deep dive, but covered some good subjects. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys have any more questions or comments, comment down below, hit the subscribe button and that bell notification to be notified when my next video will drop. Guys, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this quick overview of refeeds. God bless.